program is being held in partnership with the Jewish Community Relations Council. I'm Bertrand Ross, and I'm the Chancellor Professor of Law at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law, and your moderator for today's program. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's distinguished speaker, Aziz Huq, Professor of Law at the University of Chicago, former law clerk to Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and author of the book, How to Save Constitutional Democracy. Aziz Huq is a noted scholar on the interaction of constitutional design with individual rights and liberties. Before joining the law school faculty, Aziz worked as an associate counsel and then director of the Liberty and National Security Project of the Brennan Center for Justice at the New York University School of Law. He litigated cases in both the United States Courts of Appeals and the Supreme Court. He was also a senior consultant and analyst for the International Crisis Group, researching constitutional design and implementation in Pakistan, Nepal, Afghanistan, and Sri Lanka. He is here today to discuss the current challenges to democracy. Though the United States remains one of the strongest democratic nations in the world, Professor Huq says it is by no means immune to democratic backsliding. As the American public becomes more polarized on issues such as the freedom of press and U.S.-Russia relations and the appointment of Supreme Court justices, will our institutions hold? Do the systemic weaknesses revealed by recent pressures on the U.S. Constitution require fundamental change in how the Constitution is interpreted and implemented? How likely is it that our democracy could erode? And what can be done to mitigate the risk? To talk about all of this, please welcome Professor Aziz Huq.
Thank you very much, Bertrand, and I'm very grateful to our hosts here at the Commonwealth Club. Like many in this country, in late 2016, I began thinking about the future of our democracy and the strains that it was under. And with a colleague who teaches at the Political Science Department and the Law School at the University of Chicago, we tried to think about how the state of democracy in the United States could be understood and what the risks were to the survival and the health of American democracy in the near term. And our book, How to Save a Constitutional Democracy, addresses that question. A useful place to start thinking about the nature of the threats to American democracy is what, for many people, is the canonical example of democratic failure: the end of the Weimar Republic. And we can ask whether the events at the end of the Weimar Republic are a precursor, present a model for the kinds of threats that we face today. Right? We can focus on one particular moment in time, the evening of February the 27th, 1933, a sub-zero evening in Berlin, where a fire in the German parliamentary building, the Reichstag, leads to that building being burnt to the ground. Arriving as the flames are still burning, Chancellor Adolf Hitler seizes on the opportunity presented by the Reichstag fire to promulgate an emergency decree. It's called the Reichstag Fire Decree. The Reichstag Fire Decree suspends the rights to speech, rights to association, including political association, rights to privacy, particularly in mail and telephone, and suspends the right to a warrant before an arrest. Now, we all know what follows from that evening and from the emergency power decree that was implemented there. Well, could this happen in the United States? No and yes, I think, is the best way to think about that. No, in the following sense. A careful study of how democracy fails around the world reveals that since 1980, the use of emergency powers or coups to terminate democracy abruptly in the way that it was ended in February 1933 have fallen out of favor. So there have been 52 instances since 1982 of democratic failure around the world. Only 5 of those are cases of coups or emergency powers, right? A very small minority of instances of democratic failure since about 3 decades ago have involved sudden caesuras of democratic competition. Right? The United States, for reasons I'm happy to explain more in the Q&A, I think is not terribly vulnerable to the misuse of emergency powers as we saw in Berlin in the 1930s. Right? Our Constitution does not, by and large, explicitly contain emergency powers, and to the extent that our system of constitutional rights imposes limits upon what the government can do, the Supreme Court has carved out exceptions in the name of national security and international relations that relieve the pressure on government to suspend the rule of law more generally. Right? We saw this playing out, for example, in the travel ban case recently. The net result is that the misuse of emergency powers or a coup are reasonably unlikely in the United States. But there's another way in which what happened at the end of the Weimar Republic is a precursor and path marker for the risk of democratic failure today in the United States. And it's this. When Hitler promulgated the Reichstag fire decree, he acted lawfully under the liberal constitutional regime of the Weimar Republic. When, a few months later, he pressed the Reichstag to enact something called the Enabling Statute, a parliamentary act that suspended the operation of elections, that prorogued the operation of Parliament, and vested all authority in the Chancellorship. There were not to be elections in Germany until 1949. That too was lawful under the Weimar Constitution. That is, law and constitution provided the tools for the dismantling of democracy from within. Now, this is an important lesson, and it's one that anti-democrats around the world have learnt, albeit rather slowly. In the last 20 or 30 years, we have seen a wave of populist leaders who have come to power with a distinctive kind of rhetoric, railing against the establishment and blaming globalization and immigrants for a nation's woes, coming into power and then employing the tools of law and constitutionalism to dismantle the possibility of future democratic competition. And what my co-author and I, Tom Ginsberg, do in our book is to look at how they have done that. What's the process through which democratic competition gets undermined? And what we see, looking across the cases of populism from Latin America in the early 2000s, through to Eastern Europe, and in particular Hungary and Poland in the last 10 years, to Russia, to Israel, to Japan, to India, is that there is a consistent set of tactics, a consistent set of constitutional and legal changes that are deployed as ways of undermining democracy. Anti-democrats, that is, are learning from each other. There is a diffusion of new legal and constitutional forms of democratic backsliding around the world. What's characteristic about these new legal and constitutional vectors of democratic backsliding is that they don't take place overnight. The end of democracy, or democratic failure, is no longer a matter of democracy failing absolutely at a single moment in time. Rather, the experience of the countries in Latin America, in Eastern Europe, and in Asia has been one of slow strangulation. The metaphor of the frog sitting in boiling water that does not realize its demise is approaching because of the incremental nature of the threat is an apt one, right? Democracy no longer dies by sudden sword blows. It dies by inches. It gets worse piecemeal. Let me give you a couple of examples of how that happens and relate them to our constitutional order. I want to ask, that is, are the forms of democratic backsliding through law and constitutions that we see in other parts of the world vectors, strategies that are available under our 1787 Constitution? Are we vulnerable to the particular ways that backsliding has happened in other parts of the world, right? The answer to that question, just to disclose up front, is yes. Right? It turns out that there are roughly 5 or 6 broad categories of democratic backsliding that we see around the world, and roughly 2/3 to 3/4 are ones that are either permissible or even enabled by our Constitution. Right? So in thinking about the United States in relation to what appears to be a global wave of backsliding, it is a deep mistake to think that our otherwise venerated Constitution provides a safeguard. It doesn't. In some ways, it exacerbates the risk that we now face. Let me give you 2 examples of ways in which that is true. The first example concerns the use of institutions within a constitution that check the risk of abusive uses of authority by those in power, particularly the use of authority to entrench an elected leader or coalition beyond the possibility of democratic rotation, right? Beyond the possibility of losing at the polls the next time. Many countries have adopted in their constitution tools to mitigate this risk. South Africa is, I think, the best example. There is a whole chapter in South Africa's 1996 Constitution, Chapter 9, that creates a set of institutions like an Auditor General, a public protector who is tasked with rooting out corruption, an ombudsman and a human rights council that are tasked with preventing the abuse of individual rights by states' authorities. And all of these institutions are protected, entrenched from control by the bipartisan forces at a given moment in time. And it turns out that these kind of institutions have been very important in resisting the tide of democratic backsliding in countries like South Africa. Moreover, they're very common. If one looks around the world today, the average constitution contains 4 such institutions, right? And therefore, when a anti-democratic coalition comes to power, we should not be surprised that one of the first things that it does is to dismantle those institutions. So take the example of Hungary, where in 2010, the Fidesz party, led by Viktor Orban, came to power and engaged in a determined strategy of democratic backsliding. What was the first thing that they did? The first thing that they did was to change the constitution in order to eliminate these checking institutions from restraining their power. Turns out that they did not win a sufficient majority in Parliament in 2010 to change the Constitution. The Constitution required a 4/5 majority. They only had a bare majority. But it turned out that the 4/5 majority rule itself was not protected from amendment by majority vote. So they just changed the amendment rule, and then they rewrote the entire Constitution. And one of the most important things that they did was to take independent checking institutions like a media board, like a national bank that operates in the same way as our Federal Reserve, a media ombudsman, and various safeguards on corruption. The change in the Constitution kept those institutions but placed them completely under Fidesz control. Right? An example of that is the media ombudsman, under the control of Fidesz, forced out of business the leading billboard company operating in Hungary in a way that led to the opposition to Fidesz no longer being able to advertise in public spaces in Budapest. Could something similar happen in the United States? Well, our Constitution is old. It does not have any independent checking institutions of the kind that almost every other constitution does. Right? This is one of the prices of having an old and venerated constitution. It does not reflect the learning of the last 150 years. Worse, the Constitution, as it is now interpreted by a majority of the Supreme Court, contains an implement for unraveling those checking institutions that do exist. Of course, we have institutions that are designed to maintain the probity of government action, that are designed to make sure that we don't have partisan uses of prosecutorial power, that we don't have government self-dealing. But these institutions, things like the Office of Government Ethics, the norm against White House interference in prosecutions by the Department of Justice, are not based upon constitutional rules. They're all based upon statutes and norms or customs of independence from presidential control. The gist of the unitary executive theory that has been advanced as an interpretation of our Constitution is that these limits on presidential control are unlawful. So, for example, in one of the criminal cases brought by special counsel Robert Mueller, there is an argument by the defense that the institution of the special counsel is unlawful because the president does not have sufficient control over that office. Right? This is an instance of the unitary executive at work. And the unitary executive theory is one that has been embraced and pressed particularly hard by those justices who have worked in the White House or the executive branch, which is John Roberts, Samuel Alito, Neil Gorsuch, and Brett Kavanaugh now. Right? So that's a way in which our Constitution doesn't just fail to protect. It supplies a weapon for those who would wish to unravel some protections of democracy. A second example. In many countries, constitutional courts have played a role in preventing democratic backsliding. So, for example, in South Africa, the South African Apex Court has played a leading role in preventing President Zuma, the former President Zuma, from pushing his self-dealing and graft under the carpet. It has forced Parliament to confront Zuma in a number of cases. In Colombia, in 2012, the Constitutional Court stood in the way of President Alvaro Uribe, a very popular president, when Uribe sought to demolish term limits on the presidency. Right? South Africa and Colombia are cases in which high courts have protected democracy. Is that likely to happen here? Probably not. Why? Our Constitution contains a federal judiciary that is supposed to have the characteristic of independence from current political majorities. How does it do that? Judges are protected from removal at the back end by what's called the good behavior rule, right? Independence, that is guaranteed by limits on political control at the back end. What about at the front end? Well, unlike many other constitutions around the world, we have an overtly political appointment process. It's the president and the Senate, obviously, that engage in appointments. Were the framers unaware that that could create a risk of politicized appointments? Not entirely, right? One has to remember that the framers believed that at the national level, there would be no political parties. Right? This was Madison's insight or his theory of constitutional design. Right? The framers didn't believe there would be national political parties. And Hamilton tells us, Alexander Hamilton tells us, in Federalist 78, don't worry about the risk of strategic appointment of justices or judges, because the pool of people who are qualified enough to interpret the law is so small and those people are so steeped in their arcane books that there's no risk of strategic or partisan or biased appointment of judges or justices. So the framers' assumptions that the front end of the judicial independence dynamic, right, the way that judges and justices are appointed, did not need to be regulated because you don't have national political parties and because you have such a small pool of people to select from, right, that you're not going to get strategic action. Right? Both of those assumptions plainly fail today. The consequence is it is entirely possible to have a judiciary, or at least a Supreme Court, that is closely aligned, functionally an adjunct to a particular political party. There's nothing in the structure of our Constitution that prevents that. Indeed, it is worth recalling that the last time that we had a Supreme Court in which there was a majority of judges appointed by a Democrat was on May the 15th, 1969, when Abe Fortas resigned, right? My whole life there has been a Republican-appointed court, and there will be, I think, for the rest of it. One more point. The risk of a judiciary working in lockstep with a particular political formation is, I think, not just an abstract one. Here's one example. One thing that follows from the confirmation hearings of Justice Brett Kavanaugh is that we are likely to see calls for impeachment of Justice Kavanaugh on the basis of, for example, the allegation that he has committed perjury. Let's bracket for a second the truth or falsity of the allegation and just think about what effect the allegation has upon his motivations. The risk of impeachment is asymmetrical. Only Democrats are going to call for a Kavanaugh impeachment, and Republicans, under no conceivable state of the world, are going to demand as such. Accordingly, the safety of Justice Kavanaugh's tenure on the Supreme Court is directly related to the maintenance of Republican control of both the House and the Senate. This is an unprecedented situation. I can think of no other instance in which the survival, the persistence of a justice on the court is directly linked to the fortunes of one political party. All of this is to say that we should be cautious and skeptical of claims that in an era of global democratic backsliding, the United States is somehow distinctive, exceptional, or immune. There's no reason to think that the tactics of anti-democrats that have been birthed in the last 15 years, that have diffused across the world, cannot be used here. Indeed, in some respects, our Constitution invites them.
Our thanks to Aziz Hook. Our thanks to Aziz Hook, professor of law at University of Chicago School of Law and the author of How to Save a Constitutional Democracy. Your starting point was the Weimar Republic in Germany. And I want to return us to a starting point that parallels that time, the American Republic in the 1930s. At that time, President Roosevelt was elected in the wake of a severe depression that would engulf this nation for a long period of time. He was a charismatic leader. He was a leader that entered into power at a time when the bureaucracy was underdeveloped. And so the notion of bureaucratic autonomy as a constraint on backsliding didn't exist at that time. We also have a period in which he threatened the independence of the courts through the court and packing plan. And we have the surrounding context of populist democracies, populist systems emerging all around them. Now, that period reminded me a bit of a period that we have right now in terms of the conditions that existed then. Did we suffer from democratic backsliding in the 1930s? Is that democratic backsliding that we experience, if so, comparable to the democratic backsliding right now? And if it's not democratic backslide then, and it is now, what made the 1930s different from the period that we're in right now?
Sure. American history contains periods of democratic backsliding, but I don't think that the 1930s is one of them. I think it's really important to remember that majorities of Americans, majorities of citizens, did not have access to the ballot for much of American history. So, for example, women were excluded from the ballot in most states up until 1919 and the 19th Amendment. The voting rights of African Americans have not been consistent over time. There was a period from the 1860s to the 1890s when African Americans in the South did have access to the ballot, were effective in getting senators and representatives elected, but they were driven out from both political power and from civic life more generally in the 1890s, right, 30 years after the Civil War. So we have had periods of democratic backsliding. Why is the 1930s different, right? The 1930s were a period in which about 2/3 of European democracies failed in the face of a populist leader, a wave of populism that has many resemblances to what we see today. I think the fundamental difference between the 1930s and today lies in the nature of FDR's appeal for authority and support, which is, I think, one that is not, at its core, populist, right? There were populists at the time. The most important is Huey Long, who was the governor of Louisiana and then became the senator for Louisiana. But unlike Long, Roosevelt never campaigned on the basis of a polarized contrast between us loyal Americans and a hidden, invidious, or sinister cabal of opposition elites, right? Yes, Roosevelt had occasional careless language about the rich in some of his speeches in which he swept broadly, but he did not campaign consistently as a populist, speaking authentically in the name of the people and resisting a malevolent set of elites. So he just wasn't a populist in the way that Long was at the time, or I think Trump is today. Moreover, there was no effort to stymie democratic competition. Quite the contrary. One of the effects of the New Deal, right, and the economic support that it provided for people of lower and middling socioeconomic status was to enable their political participation. Where the New Deal fell short was where it didn't extend, because of political checks on Roosevelt, from Southern Democrats to African Americans in the South and other people of color in the West and the Southwest, right? So I think Roosevelt was a very, very different kind of leader from populists in the 1930s and certainly from Trump today.
So how do you judge the health of a constitutional democracy? And where do you think our constitutional democracy is failing or succeeding? And then to take you in a comparative direction, how does the U.S. Constitution compare to other countries? Are there particular strengths or weaknesses in our constitutional democracy as compared to others that you have studied?
A constitutional democracy is a system which has three characteristics. It has free and fair elections. It has rights to speech and association around the political process. Right? There needs to be a space for people to organize and assert themselves politically against whoever is in power. And then third, and this is something that Professor Ross's work has touched on, it needs a system of bureaucratic institutions that are devoted to the rule of law sufficiently to prevent the politicization and the polarization of elections or criminal justice, right? In the absence of a sufficiently robust and independent elections and criminal justice system, it is very hard to have constitutional democracy, right? And the success or failure of a democratic system can't be measured in some numerical scale that goes from 0 to 100. It's rather a system-level effect of the interaction between those three things: free and fair elections, liberal rights to speech and association, and bureaucratic or administrative rule of law when it comes to elections and criminal justice. And my own view is that the United States is doing reasonably well, but not as well as it was 5 years ago along all of those metrics. And we can talk specifically about how each of them is faring. I think that part of the reason why we are not doing as well as we could is that our Constitution, again, by dint of its age, right? Constitutions are just pieces of technology. Our Constitution is roughly as old as James Watt's steam engine, which you can go and see in the British Museum in London, right? Your cars, your automobiles, do not contain a steam engine akin to James Watt's steam engine, right? Technology develops. You guys use styluses. You don't use quill pens. Yet we still use the Constitution as it was designed in 1787, right? So our Constitution has weaknesses, and I mentioned a couple, but the book talks about a bunch more. And those weaknesses are quite predictable, given its age.
So your focus is on how constitutional democracies can be saved, and it raises a question of, was there a specific event that prompted the belief that constitutional democracies needed to be saved?
On my part, I will say, and I'm cognizant that the Commonwealth Club is a non-partisan institution, I will say that the campaign strategies we all observed during the 2016 election campaign raised grave worries, in my mind, about the future of constitutional democracy. I think when a candidate for the presidency campaigns on the basis of his opponent's inherent guilt, when he declines to say that he'll accept a losing result, I could go on, but it would be a long, long list, right? And you guys all know that. You know the list. I think that it's reasonable to ask, when the immense powers of the presidency are vested in such hands, whether that fact alone imposes or creates a risk to our system's democratic health, right? I don't think that that's an unreasonable or partisan stimulus to thought.
So in those comments, you described our shift towards a presidential democracy in which the executive has accumulated considerable power in our system of governance. It makes you think about the alternatives out there. What about a UK parliamentary system? Would that act as more of a constraint against constitutional democracy's failure than the system we have now? And while it may be a more academic counterfactual, was the mistake in governance and the mistake made in our Constitution made at the founding in the choice of our system of governance?
If one looks around the world at the rise of populisms in different countries, we see populisms emerging in parliamentary as well as presidential systems. The difference appears to be that in parliamentary systems, populist parties, and one can think of examples here in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in France, and in Denmark, more rapidly obtain a seat at the table. They seize some measure of political power in a parliamentary system quicker than in a presidential system, right? But in part because they have a seat at the table, it is often difficult for them to seize power completely, right? What will happen is generally the right of centre party will tack even further rightward, particularly on issues like immigration or culture, and try and steal some of the thunder of the populist party, right? In a presidential system like ours, populists have a much harder time getting their foot in the door. But when they do get their foot in the door, the effects can be much, much more dramatic than in a parliamentary system. The key institutional dynamic in the United States in this regard is actually not the choice of a presidential system as opposed to a parliamentary system, right? It's the changing way that political parties select candidates for the president, right? This goes to the second part of the question. It's hard to blame the Constitution completely for Donald Trump, right? He took a long time coming if you thought that it was the Constitution to blame. And I think it is more useful to think of the emergence of American populism in light of changes to the ways that political parties have selected their presidential candidates. So up until somewhere between the late 1960s and the early 1980s, the elites within a party, the people who identified professionally with a party, played a big role in preserving and maintaining the party's brand by exercising control over the kind of candidates that would be selected for the presidential ticket. In the last 20 or 30 years, that control by party elites has declined. Right? Both the Democrats and the Republicans have responded to the fact of electoral failure by giving more power to the party rank and file. Indeed, the Democrats just took a further step in this direction by reducing the power of the superdelegates within the convention structure. It is the weakening control of professional politicians who have an interest in running more centrist candidates that I think has been key to the emergence of forms of populism on both the Democratic and the Republican side of the spectrum, right? I don't think you can completely ignore the parallels between the style of politics that we see on the Democratic side in candidates ranging from Barack Obama through to Bernie Sanders, and the style of outsider politics that we've now seen on the Republican side, right? Both of them are, in some way, responses to the incentives created by the presidential candidate selection mechanism. So it's I think easy to blame the framers for all the things they did not anticipate, right? The framers thought that by building an extended republic out of 13 states, they would avoid the emergence of national-level political factions like political parties, right? Well, that didn't turn out all that well, right? Madison and Hamilton and Washington were all pivotal in the creation of the first party system in the middle of the 1790s, right? A party system that contravened the basic assumptions of their federalism and separation of powers system, right? But the framers, I think it's fair to say, did the best they could, given the relatively limited stock of examples they had to hand, and were, to an extent that we forget today, deeply pragmatic people. Right? Madison famously asked Jefferson when Jefferson was in Paris, "Send me a box of books about constitutions." Right? I want to know how constitutions in Europe and in the ancient world were written so we can learn how to do ours. And I recognize that there's things that I don't know and I need to learn and things that might go wrong, but then we should be open to fixing those. Right? So the framers did the best they could, and true, they fell short in many respects, but I think their response would have been to say, we should learn. We should learn from our own experience, and we should learn from the experience of other countries, and do our best to fix the mistakes or the errors that past generations made.
So We are in the Bay Area, and the Bay Area is a place of disruption. Disruptive technology is kind of our modus operandi here. How do we think about disrupting democratic backsliding? And I was struck by a passage in your book about charismatic populism, and particularly President Trump. And the passage in the book describes how even if President Trump isn't serving his core constituents, he is unlikely to lose popularity with those core constituents. And when I think of core constituents, I think of working class and low income voters and individuals in our country who are said to be the Trump voters, particularly working class white voters that are said to be the Trump voters. Even though he is advancing policies that many agree are harmful or neglectful of the very class of supporters that he has, yet you note in your book that that very fact of being neglectful and harmful to the class of supporters actually reinforces his hold over that class of people, because it reinforces the narrative that it is the system that has caused you your harm, and I am the only person here who is looking out for your interests. And so, even though he is not actually looking out for the interests, and misinformation plays a role. So it made me quite discouraged in terms of how do we disrupt populism if populism has such a hold on a class of individuals that makes up quite a large segment of our population.
Populism is a style of politics that depends upon a binary opposition between an authentic people, represented by a leader who claims to channel and speak for that people, and a corrupt elite, often that's seen as being aligned with some kind of globalized conspiracy. Right? The globalized conspiracy is often described in either vaguely anti-Semitic terms of cosmopolitans, or in vaguely or openly racist terms with respect to migrants. The force of the populist appeal in many countries is the discontent that individuals feel at, on the one hand, economic malaise, and on the other hand, the sense that government is not providing for their economic and cultural security. Right? And economic and cultural security, I think, are often entangled with each other. The populist wins by vocalizing the discontent that people feel, by saying, I speak for you, right? And the actual policies that a populist pursues turn out not to be terribly important to maintaining, it's almost always his, very few cases of her, Evita, Christina Kirchner are exceptions, his appeal. So we see across the spectrum of examples of populism today, instances of populism that are left of center. Venezuela, I think, is the best example there. And examples of populism that are right of center and deeply globalist, neoliberal, some would say, in their orientation. Hungary is a good example there. And it turns out that the actual cluster of policies adopted by a populist don't really matter, right? The attention is devoted to the idea that the populist speaks for the underdog, the marginalized, right? And when the policies adopted by the populist redound to the harm of the underdog, that doesn't necessarily undermine the populist's base of electoral support. The populist can say, well, it's the deep state that is hindering my ability to deliver, right? It's this globalist conspiracy that in the form of cheap Chinese goods is undermining my ability to return jobs of the following kind to your counties, right? There's always someone else to blame. That is the characteristic sleight of hand that populism manages. It is a really, really hard question how to end the appeal of populism, right? It is something that I don't think anyone has a great answer for. I think that a really interesting example of how it can happen is, at least in part, is provided by South Africa. In South Africa, under President Jacob Zuma, you had a regime that had started out as a liberatory regime. The ANC was responsible for bringing South Africa out of apartheid. Over time, it becomes increasingly corrupt, increasingly demagogic, right? Reaching its apex with President Jacob Zuma. Zuma is forced out of office in February of this year, right? He's forced out of office because institutions like the Public Protector and the Constitutional Court repeatedly insisted, despite both political and legal attacks on their authority, on pushing forward evidence of Zuma's deep personal corruption, right? The fact that he was not serving the people, the fact that he was serving himself, for example, by building a set of extremely expensive accoutrements to his family home, right? Sports facilities, a chicken run, a helicopter pad, right? It was the fact of their insistence upon his financial venality that led to deep losses in the ANC's campaigns at the municipal level, and finally to the perception within the ANC that Zuma was a figure that had to be jettisoned in order to retain electoral competition. The Democrats have not found a way of making that point with respect to President Trump, right? And it is an open question how electoral or a rhetorical strategy that focuses on personal self-dealing could be successfully deployed in the United States, right? And notice that you can be a Republican and be equally concerned with that dynamic. You can think, look, I'm a Republican who stands for a certain set of values that are traditionally associated with the Republican Party, such as fiscal conservatism, strength in national security, a certain commitment to a set of moral values that are represented both by us as individuals and us as a party. And you can think that that changes to the Republican Party's orientation recently are undesirable. And you can be interested in trying to find a way to bring the party back to its historical self, right? So I don't think that the point that I'm making or the concern that I'm articulating is one that is partisan in nature, right? One can be either Democrat or Republican and want a political system overall that is not beholden to the pathologies of populism and not subject to the risks of democratic failure.
Well, thinking about the operation of our democracy right now, in a context in which we're trying to wrestle with the tragedy of the Saudi journalist who was allegedly killed in Turkey, brings some reflection on the role of the media here. And the role of the media as, the commonly conceived the fourth branch as a check on our system of governance. What do you think about the strength of the fourth branch of government in the United States now? Is there democratic backsliding? Can it be attributed to a declining strength? The attacks have been faced by the fourth branch, by our current president. And is that a necessary institution to disrupt or constrain backsliding?
You cannot have a democracy unless you have a public sphere in which there is a shared foundation of facts. You can't talk about policy and public choices about how government power is to be used without some basis of shared factual knowledge. And in order to have that critical component of the public sphere, you need a media. There haven't been democracies, at least in the modern era, in the absence of a media. Right? We've had a robust press since the time of the founding. I cannot think of a single democracy that does not have a robust media. I think the story of the American public sphere in the last 2 years is a complex one. And I would pick out 3 different strands that cut in slightly different directions. So the first strand is the one that hinges upon our robust First Amendment tradition of anti-censorship and of protection of dissenting voices. Right? Our Constitution has, in this regard, served us very well. Right? There are, every week, stories that are critical of the party in power, the occupant of the White House, in ways that he clearly does not like. That is an indication of the strength of our democracy, right? But our First Amendment conceptualizes threats to the public sphere in a very narrow way, right? Now, I could talk here about the threat posed by the influence of wealth in the campaign context, but that's something that predates our current political moment, although I think it's very important to keep at the back of one's mind. But let me pick out 2 ways in which the First Amendment does not effectively protect the public sphere. The first way is in respect to the federal government's awesome regulatory powers, right? The federal government gets to decide, for example, through the Federal Trade Commission and the Justice Department, when cable and television news providers can merge, right? It gets to decide on what kind of rates are charged by the post office to various media companies, right? There is evidence that the use of regulatory powers, particularly in the antitrust domain, is influencing choices made by media companies. And the First Amendment imposes no great constraint upon the federal government's power to use otherwise non-speech related statutory authorities, the authority of the antitrust laws, the authority to set rates for the post office, right, in ways that effectively stifle speech. A second way in which our First Amendment falls short is that it imposes very little or no constraint upon what the government can say. There is no obligation on the part of government officials to tell the truth as a matter of the Constitution, and there's no obligation for them to refrain from what, in the hands of, or when coming from the mouth of a private actor, could be condemned as libel or slander or an invitation to violence, right? So your senator, for example, Dianne Feinstein, was the subject of a concerted diatribe at a recent campaign rally that ended in a chorus of chants of "lock her up," right? The Constitution has nothing to say about the way in which people can be bullied, slandered, or even threatened with violence of one shape or form by people with the power to do those things. So that's, I think, a very important gap in our constitutional order, and it's a way that people can be silenced. The third piece of the puzzle with respect to the public sphere is the fact that you don't need to censor people anymore to stifle news. Right? This, I think, is the story of social media. Right? This is the lesson that we have learned from the ways that Facebook and Twitter, in particular, have altered public debate. Right? If you can alter the things that people immediately see, their limited capacity to absorb and filter different and new sources of information lead them to believe falsehoods over truths, right? So the technological structure of the public sphere, particularly as it extends in the social media domain, is no longer a technological structure that conduces to truth, right? This is the deep problem posed by, can I say the Bay Area?
You can. Well, let me get you to focus on another institution, an institution that you're quite familiar with and I'm quite familiar with, the university. The university has been accused, and perhaps accurately so, as having a liberal bias. A faculty that tend to be left of center, maybe even far left of center, dominate faculties in the United States. To the extent that liberal bias institutions are propagating a liberal bias view of the world and are, in a sense, becoming the image of what the elite class is, how much does that contribute to perhaps the marginalization that contributes to the empowerment of populist leaders? How much does that contribute to democratic erosion, in your opinion?
Sure. I think that there is a fundamental tension between populist leaders and universities. And the academy more generally. And I think that the tension arises not because academics tend to be left of center, which is true on the humanities and social sciences side, not necessarily true on the sciences side. It's because a norm of academia, as you and I practice it, is a commitment to truth, right? A commitment to the possibility of testing factual and value claims, and throwing out those claims if they fail the test of rigorous inquiry, right? That is the core of academia at its best. That kind of rigorous testing of truth, be it truth about the world and truth about facts, or truth about values, right, which I think are just as important in some measure as factual claims about the world. That idea of testing facts and values against what we know is anathema to the strategies and the rhetoric of many populist leaders. And this is why we have seen attacks on the academy across a number of different populist contexts. So, for example, in Hungary, the Fidesz party has attacked the European University founded by George Soros. In India, the BJP has attempted to close a number of universities that were more independent than the BJP liked. In the United States, there's not just the rhetorical attack upon universities. There are efforts to harm universities, and I would put the travel ban into this category, as ongoing institutions. For example, there was a story recently that the president's advisor, Stephen Miller, proposed ending Chinese student visas, not because it was an effective tool in the trade war, but because it would hurt American universities. And American universities were seen as enemies of the administration. So my own view is that there is absolutely a tension between populism and universities, but the tension is one that arises because of different views about the value of truth-seeking.
So I want to bring you to a couple of our institutions of governance and probe you on two proposals that would require a constitutional amendments. One proposal, in light of the Justice Kavanaugh confirmation, is the idea of term limits on Supreme Court justices. That has gained some steam over the last few weeks and has been in the mainstream of thought for several years now. Is that a part of maybe instilling in an institution some constraints on backsliding? And then the second one has to do with the Senate. the Senate as it's constructed, and the way that the population exists in our country, or as it's spread in our country, contributes to minority control, at least in one branch of government. Now, that's a part of the Constitution that cannot be amended according to the Constitution, but anything's possible, I suppose. But do you think that that is part of the problem that contributes to backsliding, or is there some perhaps benefit from having a system of government through which the system of elections cannot be manipulated?
The proposals to impose term limits on the Supreme Court, I think, are responses to the perception, an accurate perception, that the Supreme Court has become aligned to one particular partisan formation, right? It's become an adjunct to the Republican Party. And I think that there's reasonable evidence of that in studies of the way that justices vote and studies of the effects of their rulings. I don't think that term limits would solve the problem or solve that problem precisely because of the dynamics of the Senate that you identified, right? So long as it's a president who is selected in a way that favors rural states and disfavors large coastal states such as California and New York, provided that the Senate is the check on presidential authority, and the Senate is biased in demographic terms, in favor of smaller states against larger states such as the coastal ones, justices will tend to reflect the interests of a political side that is not necessarily the political side that a majority of the American people support. It will tend to be a partisan institution. My own view is that a response to this situation should focus upon reducing the powers of the court. And it turns out that our Constitution is actually quite amenable. It's relatively straightforward to dramatically reduce the power of the court through a range of different ways. And I think that that really should be the focus, not term limits. On the Senate, I think that the Senate is a deep, deep problem. And I am not optimistic about the possibility of constitutional amendment. There is a movement to hold a new constitutional convention. We are very close, I think 4 or 5 states away from triggering that possibility under Article 5 of our Constitution. This movement, however, is largely funded by the Koch brothers. It's largely focused upon adding a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. The important thing to say is that were something like that to happen, I think that we really have no idea what a constitutional convention would do. It's good to recall that the last constitutional convention we had was in 1787, and it was given the task of coming up with some minor amendments to the Articles of Confederation. And it chucked that mission within the first few days of its meeting and decided to write a whole new constitution. I have no reason to think that a new constitutional convention would be any more disciplined. So the real solution is for liberals to move to North Dakota.
Right. It's lovely in winter, I hear. So we're down to 2 minutes, so this will be the last question I'll ask for you, and I'll try to constrain it because it was originally a bigger question. Let's say we do have a constitutional convention. What is the first thing you would propose in that constitutional convention as perhaps the most important safeguard against democratic erosion?
I think that we need an electoral system that accurately translates the preferences of the American people into political power. And that means having a system that is far more proportional and undistorted than the system that we have now. And it means further finding ways to cap explicitly and clearly the influence of wealth on the exercise of political power. I think if we have those measures in place, and there's a bunch of different ways in which you can do those things, right? And in various ways, other countries have successfully pursued them. I think that we are much better positioned to resist the allure of populists and the democratic backsliding that populists bring in their wake?
Well, thanks again to Professor Aziz Hook,
Thank you.
Professor of Law at the University of Chicago and author of a book, How to Save a Constitutional Democracy. We also thank everyone here as well as our audience on radio, television, and the internet. The program has been held in partnership with the Jewish Community Relations Council, and we want to remind everyone that copies of Professor Hook's book are available in the back of the room, and he'll be pleased to sign them following the program. I had a chance to read the book the past week, and I highly recommend it. It is a page turner of a book, which is rare from us law professors sometimes. So I'm Professor Bertrand Ross of UC Berkeley School of Law, and now this meeting of the Commonwealth Club, the place where you're in the know, is adjourned.
Thanks.